My name is Kelly.
And my name is Will.
We are two Florida attorneys
Who love our 5 dogs.
and 2 cats.
And love listening to true crime.
Mainly me.
So I hope you enjoy our show as we delve into all things spooky.
This is For Crime's Sake. Good morning, everyone.
Or afternoon. Or evening.
Whenever you're listening. Welcome to this week's episode of For Crime's Sake. And today we have the OG, Mr. Hamilton Adam, back in the studio with us for his 3rd appearance. And at this point, he's basically an expert.
A very handsome expert.
He is.
A dashing expert. I know. At this point, I'm going to say it's not going to be too long before Hamilton starts his own podcast. He's quite popular. People seem to like him.
He's very small and very elderly.
Yes, he is. So Kelly, what is on the docket this week?
So, I actually just started, I think it was the show Love and Death, and it's based on actually a true crime story, the murder of Betty Gore. And
is this the show you were watching last night?
Yes. And I'm going to watch, it was a 3-part release. I've watched 1 episode, so I'm going to finish out that. And it was really good. Elizabeth Olsen plays Candy Montgomery, who is actually who killed Betty Gore, and she does a great job. I'm really impressed with her.
I was going to say, I don't really know what it's about. I wasn't paying super close attention, but the cast is killer. So,
oh, yeah.
I mean,
it was great.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What about you, Will?
Well, we finally got to watch Scream 6 this weekend, which was awesome. If you haven't watched it, it's incredible.
So good.
So
oh my
good.
God, I loved it. It was one of my favorites too.
Yeah, I think it's arguably going to be one of my favorites in the franchise once it's all said and done. But now, because I got to watch it for fun the first time, now I want to go back and watch it with a more critical eye, because Scream, for those of you who know or don't know, is pretty big into commentary on the genre and sort of like being very meta and in its own space, and always has been. And so it's really cool. It's really fun. I love the franchise. So now I have to go back and look for more Easter eggs and fun stuff.
So today we are covering the suspicious death of Michelle Witherell. Sources for this episode include UnsolvedMysteries.com, the U.S. Sun, and the archives of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. So today's case is, as I said, a mysterious death, arguably a murder. But this case is a little bit different because, unlike our typical cases, where we need to spend a lot of time talking about potential suspects and asking what might have happened here in this case, we actually have a very viable suspect and a pretty reasonable idea of what happened. And there was actually an arrest and an eventual trial.
Which is wild because we rarely see answers, let alone an arrest and trial. Exactly.
In this one, we have a lot of answers here, but not quite enough, as you will see. Unfortunately, and this depends, on your perspective and who you believe, but just because someone is brought to trial, it doesn't always mean that justice is served.
It does not.
Whether or not justice was served in this case is a question for each of us to explore individually and debate in the law. But there is no debate about one thing. This case deserves the public's attention. So our story begins December 20th, 1992. And Michelle Witherell, a 24-year-old native of Denver, Colorado, had recently relocated with her husband, Jeremey Witherell, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to take a new job. Michelle's parents Everett and Kathy Malema describe Michelle in the time prior to her marriage as a beautiful, bright, and accomplished woman. And while we don't have a ton of information in this case about Michelle's early life, we do know that she and Jeremey were married approximately 4 months prior to the events of this case. So they were very much still newlyweds, and they were also very new to the Pittsburgh area.
And I did find it interesting because I did some digging on this one, and it really, and maybe it's just a lack of coverage on it, but there really isn't a lot of backstory, much pre-Jeremey and pre-arriving in Pittsburgh. It's really...
Yes, and that's probably is partly because there wasn't a ton of media coverage. Like, I tried to even search how many podcasts had done it, and it was very few that I found, and TV shows and stuff, which is interesting because there's a lot going on here.
It's a really odd case. It's a really interesting case, and it's no less compelling than a lot of the others that we see all the time.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm sure this is already becoming extremely obvious, but Michelle's marriage is going to play a big role in what transpired. So we're back December 20th, 1992, with a frantic phone call to 911 from Jeremey, who told authorities that he had just discovered his wife Michelle near death on the asphalt below the couple's third-floor apartment.
What a horrific thing to find.
Horrible. I can't even imagine. Michelle was still alive when first responders arrived, but she was unresponsive, and sadly, she would pass away in the hospital roughly 14 hours later. And
right there, we have another important distinction. Most of our cases, we don't have someone alive when someone gets there. It's odd. It's interesting.
Yes, but she was unresponsive, so not able, unfortunately,
to offer anything.
Exactly. So, in his 911 call, Jeremey had told authorities that Michelle had been on the balcony of the apartment and that she had jumped off. And it's really important to remember that throughout this initial 6-minute phone call, Jeremey is repeatedly insistent that Michelle jumped from the balcony. He mentions it numerous times. So later that night, Jeremey would explain to police that he was inside the apartment playing solitaire when he heard a thud.
And I know this is not the point, but I am curious because this is 1992. Do we think he was playing solitaire on a computer, or was he just sitting in his house late at night by himself with cards playing solitaire by himself?
I'm hoping on a computer. I don't know why that makes it any,
I don't know if it makes it any better, but it feels somehow better.
This is totally, off topic, but I have gotten, things in my email saying, hey, play solitaire, win, $80 per game or something. I don't know. It's a thing.
People bet on solitaire?
I don't know what happens. I never checked it out, but there is a thing. Maybe you should look into it.
Yeah, what a time. And old Jeremey was allegedly sitting around playing solitaire.
Yeah. Okay. While his wife is out on the balcony. Yeah, you would think he would even offer, maybe they could play a game together, like War.
Yeah, right? Like a 2-player game.
Yeah.
Not so
fish,
much.
something. Anyway, so upon investigating, he says he found Michelle laying on the ground and called 911. He told authorities that Michelle was hanging Christmas lights on the balcony and that she must have jumped or fallen. So when Jeremey talks to law enforcement, he first adds the alternative explanation that Michelle might have fallen rather than jumped.
Very self-serving.
Exactly. It's because at first in the phone call, it's all about jumping. She jumped. He saw her jump. And then it's well, guess she might have fallen. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a real change of tone from the initial call. And this is just minutes apart.
The only thing, though, that I'd be curious is how it went down. Did the police say, are you sure she jumped? Like, if they're constantly questioning, are you sure she jumped?
Right.
Are you sure she jumped? She couldn't have fallen. And I could see that you're like, I don't know.
That, and in fairness to Jeremey, if, this happened the way he says it happened, then, he's under the stress of finding his wife nearly dead and comatose outside their apartment. I guess we can probably excuse that he might not use the right words.
And when you're calling 911, it's your first, what you saw. But as you have time to think about it, you process it and you start maybe changing what you initially believed was one thing that, hey, you could concede. Maybe it wasn't that and it could be something else.
It's not enough to convict anybody for anything, but it's interesting and noteworthy.
Exactly. And arguably as troubling is that Jeremey says Michelle was on the balcony putting up Christmas lights, but this was 12:30 in the morning.
That's weird.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on the correct time to hang Christmas lights, but 12:30 a.m. just seems odd.
That's a weird time to decide, hey, I'm gonna head out to the balcony and hang some Christmas lights. Why don't you go play solitaire?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's bizarre. Again, it's not a conviction for anything. It's bizarre.
So while that story is certainly plausible, it's a bit of a stretch.
I'd agree.
It's also important to place this event in the context of the evening leading up to this and in the context of Michelle and Jeremey's marriage. So although the couple was still newly married, it seems things were going downhill pretty quickly, unfortunately. At the time of Michelle's death, the two had only been in Pittsburgh for about a month, but neighbors were already noticing problems. Several reported hearing loud verbal altercations between Jeremey and Michelle, and even speculated that things turn violent, perhaps.
That's a really bad sign 4 months into the marriage.
Yeah.
That should still be pretty much honeymoon phase.
It's really sad.
That is really sad.
Some of these arguments were so loud that they prompted neighbors to report it to the building manager. They also reported Michelle appearing bruised and battered at times, and even reported hearing an argument the night of Michelle's death. So already we have a reason to believe the marriage was tense, if not outright violent.
Yeah, pretty suspicious. Something to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. So the night before Michelle's
alleged fall.
Exactly. The night before, which was December 19th, according to Jeremey, the couple spent the evening at a local bar where they each had several drinks before heading home. Jeremey told investigators that they paid their tab and left the bar around 12:30 a.m., which is important because it would only give the couple about enough time to drive home and walk inside before Michelle's alleged fall.
And it would have had to be a pretty quick turnaround. I think it said maybe it was like a 10-minute drive from the bar to their home, and he's calling 911 at 12:42, something like that, 12:45, somewhere in there.
Exactly.
So this means if this is what happened, then it means they basically leave the bar, walk in the door of their home, and
he starts playing solitaire, and then
Michelle just goes to hang up Christmas lights.
Yep.
Okay.
A receipt from the bar would show that they actually paid and left closer to 10:15 p.m. though.
So that's interesting.
It is.
That's
So he tells investigators his story is 12:30 a.m., which is technically December 20th.
Right?
But the receipt shows 10:15. So could it have just been an error, drinking? I don't know.
Again, under the stress of the event, maybe, but that
a couple hours.
The difference of a couple hours and an important couple hours,
exactly,
right before his wife seems to be in pretty bad shape and ultimately dies.
So that discrepancy in time is especially relevant because several neighbors reported hearing the couple arguing late into the night and into the hours leading up to Jeremey calling 911.
So Jeremy's got a problem there.
Yep. If they had been at the bar until 12:30, as Jeremey suggested, then they wouldn't have been out at the time neighbors say that they heard the fighting between them.
And we know that Jeremy's time frame is the wrong one.
Exactly, because we have the receipt from the bar.
Interesting. That's another self-serving thing.
Yep.
Could it be an innocent misstep? Maybe, but it's awfully beneficial to Jeremey.
So at this point, what we have is a rocky marriage, a night of drinking, and two very important discrepancies in accounts of the evening given by Jeremey and Michelle nearly dead at the base of the couple's apartment.
Yeah, so this isn't looking great for Jeremey right now.
No, not at all. I really don't like the discrepancies at this point. That's a pretty big time gap, but okay, so right now that's where we're at. Let's see, because obviously that's not in and of itself enough.
No, but especially the neighbors saying they were fighting during that time, and he's like, no, we were at the bar that time, during that time.
Well, now we know why it was so important for him not to be home.
We do. It makes sense.
Things already look bad, right?
They really do.
But then let's start looking at the forensic evidence, right? And now, at this point, go from bad to worse. First and foremost, the balcony from which Michelle allegedly fell had a 4-foot-tall safety railing on it. And this was obviously to prevent exactly this kind of accident.
Yeah, no kidding.
That would have, put the top of the railing roughly chest height with Michelle. The idea that Michelle could accidentally fall over a railing of that height borders on ridiculous. So Michelle was found approximately 9 feet out from the balcony, meaning that she would have had to use force to propel herself forward, which, once again, doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah, what a weird thing to do if it's an accident, that doesn't make any sense. So then it's, suicide, and she leapfrogged off the side of the building?
That's the thing, with those facts, it feels like it would have to have been intentional. Right?
Yeah, I would think so.
Accidental doesn't seem likely.
No.
Also curious is that one of Michelle's shoes was found approximately 26 feet from her body, but her other shoe was never found.
That is bizarre.
How weird, right? Where did the shoe go?
What happened there?
They never found it. So it was not in her apartment. It was not on the street. So
where did this shoe go?
Out. So then let's think about this, right? She's supposedly out there putting up Christmas lights.
With one shoe. And then that shoe flies across the yard, super far away. That's weird.
I mean, I guess if you're drinking, you lose your shoe. I don't know.
I don't know. But then she's so drunk that she decides she's going to go put Christmas lights on the balcony.
And he's drunk and he plays solitaire.
And he's like, okay,
drunk.
Well, you go do that. I'm going to play solitaire. This will be fine.
It's weird. Okay. I guess moving on from that. So let's get to Michelle's injuries, which are going to be the feature of the rest of this case for a few reasons. So right off the bat, Michelle's parents found it really bizarre that their daughter had allegedly fallen several stories to the asphalt and hit her head so hard that she was rendered comatose and her jaw was broken, but there was no injury whatsoever to Michelle's teeth and nose.
And that makes zero sense at all.
No,
I mean,
so
how
weird.
do you explain that?
I know. Additionally, both of Michelle's wrists were broken as though she had tried to use her hands to break her fall, but there were no scratches or damage to her palms, which you would expect if you're putting your hands out
and especially,
brace your fall.
If you're falling 30 or 40 feet, too, onto asphalt. So, I mean, those are some pretty big issues right there.
Finally, although Jeremey allegedly heard a thud and immediately ran to Michelle's aid to call 911, the balcony door was discovered to be almost completely shut, and the door to the apartment was double locked, which would suggest that Jeremey would have closed both doors and locked both doors to the apartment.
Locked two locks on his apartment, two physical locks.
Yes.
And then he's going to go downstairs and check to see if his wife, who he thinks is just fallen off a balcony, is okay.
So he's making sure to lock all the doors before attempting to render aid to his wife.
Okay, Jeremy. I don't know. I don't know about all that.
Oh my gosh. Jeez, I'd be so disappointed. Like, I mean, that'd be a problem.
Yeah, it's terrible.
You know, in the movie, what was it? The Guardian? What was it with Ashton Kutcher? What was that movie where he's like...
Oh, The Guardian.
The Guardian. I thought it, but then I...
No, you were right.
Myself. Yeah, The Guardian, and the people in the beginning, and the husband doesn't... He pushes past his wife to get to safety. Do you remember that?
Yes.
That... I mean,
it's like, here, let me stop and lock both doors to my apartment
like
before I get downstairs to see if my wife is alive.
That's a real telling moment. That's basically...
Yeah, right? This case in a nutshell.
Yeah. So one other point regarding oddities on scene that night deserves mention because of the status of this case. So, and I don't want to lean too heavily on this, but apparently, according to Michelle's parents, Jeremey gave them several additional accounts of what happened, which were dramatically different from one to the next and threw up enormous red flags in regards to Jeremey. And he didn't need any more red flags.
No, certainly not.
he was out of flags at this point. So, and that said, Jeremey has denied to this day that he made these statements, and there's no evidence other than Michelle's parents' testimony to corroborate them. And these statements were like, in one, I think the example was that, he was playing solitaire, heard a thud, and then ran out. And then in another version of it that he told her parents was he ran out and she was still hanging on to the ledge.
Which is wildly different. Like, that's a pretty dramatic difference.
Yes. So it was stuff like that. And to be very clear, that doesn't mean Jeremey didn't say those things or that we have any reason to disbelieve Michelle's parents, but simply that of all the issues with this case, the conflict in the evidence is arguably the most readily provable and problematic issue in terms of Jeremey's guilt or innocence. Ultimately, though, the coroner at the time ruled the manner of death as undetermined, meaning the coroner in 1992 did not find enough evidence to make a finding as to whether this was a suicide, homicide, or an accident.
And that makes investigation tough.
Yes, that is really tough. And that's tough for the prosecutors, the state.
For sure. Yeah. It makes that difficult.
Further, Jeremey was heavily investigated by law enforcement and was even willing to submit to 2 polygraph examinations, which he allegedly passed.
We know how we all feel about polygraph.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. It's noteworthy.
And at this point, the investigation was generally considered an accident and was closed. And the case stayed closed for about 6 whole years. But Michelle's family wasn't sitting around twiddling their thumbs during those years.
No, they were not.
Instead, they took all of the evidence in their daughter's death and found other help.
And I just want to point out, I love this for 2 reasons. One is, at least the police closed the case, so the family could get the evidence.
Exactly, absolutely.
Get it out there.
And we see that so often, how police refuse to hold on to it.
Like years later, and it's like, let it go, let someone else look.
Because that's the thing, because you're not entitled to certain records and stuff like that when an investigation is open. Mm-hmm. And that makes a big difference for family members. And if a family wants to, hire their own investigators and stuff like that, it makes that a lot more difficult.
Yeah. So whatever their reason for closing it, at least they did close it so the family was able to take these next steps.
Her parents sent Michelle's medical records to 3 separate forensic pathologists, and all three determined Michelle's death to have been the result of homicide. Three.
That's okay. So that's pretty significant.
Just because that's wild. Three separate ones. I mean, granted, they were paid for.
Yes, expert testimony. Yeah, they always take it with a grain of salt. But still, three experts in agreement.
Yeah,
it's pretty good.
And among these experts, too, were University of Pittsburgh Medical School professor and renowned neurosurgeon, Dr. Donald W. Marion. And he was treating roughly 200 head injuries every year. Another one of their experts was Dr. Cyril H. Wecht, who ultimately was elected as Allegheny County coroner, the county where Michelle died.
Which, that's pretty lucky. That's pretty good for the family, I would think.
And it also shows that they were picking
qualified people.
Qualified, legit.
These weren't hacks for money.
Exactly. And following his election, Dr. Wecht used the powers of his office, buttressed by support from other experts in the field, to reopen the investigation into Michelle's death.
That's incredible.
No, he took it upon himself.
It's wild. And he used this provision, this thing he was able to do, which basically said, here, I want to convene an independent group of experts to look at this and tell me if I should reopen this case.
Exactly.
It's incredible.
So that's how strongly he felt about this, that this was homicide. So finally, on December 20th, 1999, 7 years to the day of Michelle's death, Jeremey was arrested and charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter.
Beautiful.
Maybe not. The case against Jeremey Witherell went to trial in January of 2001. And although all of this evidence and testimony was presented to the jury, 12 men and women took about just 2 hours to return a verdict of not guilty.
That's wild. That's wild.
And we weren't on the jury, so we don't know.
And that's the thing. Yeah. It's we can only speculate as to a lot of this, but what a bummer after what seems like the right answer. It's like, yes, it's reopened. We have an arrest. We have a trial. And then a 2-hour not guilty.
Yes. And I mean, that's the thing, is especially in homicide trials, deliberation can take weeks.
Yeah. I mean a long time.
Hours.
It should be given due consideration.
Exactly. And in this case, it was a very quick 2 hours. Why that's the case, we don't know. As you said, we can speculate as to reasons, but I mean, we don't know. And the jury was the ones that were there and listened to all the evidence, to all the testimony, and they made that decision. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's hard to say for sure because jury deliberations are private and jurors can not be compelled to discuss their service.
That's important. I mean, that is really important. It's an important protection that's in place for reasons.
Absolutely, because you don't want a jury to
be afraid of rendering a just verdict.
Yeah, you can't listen to the clamor of the crowd.
Exactly. You can't get afraid of what people will say about you.
But with that said, the jury forewoman, Tijuana Phelps Jackson, did make the following statement after the jury delivered its verdict. We didn't feel as though the state had proved its case totally. We felt that maybe something had happened, but we didn't know for sure. And it seems like with that statement, the state just didn't prove it. It just wasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And if that's the case, if that is how it was, you cannot convict.
No, you can't, because that is the standard. That's the burden of proof. And I mean, obviously, we weren't there. We don't know. We have very limited information to go on. But one thing that I think we can extrapolate from that statement is they felt that something happened, but just that the state didn't prove its case. Well, if something happened, what do they think happened? How do they think it happened? And I have to wonder how much of this became an issue that, we do see sometimes, which is you get a battle of the experts where you have a bunch of highbrow expert testimony, and you're asking 12 jurors to sit there and listen and understand and internalize all of this and then make a decision as to which expert is better and more credible. And that's a really hard thing to ask a jury to do.
I agree. And generally, too, you'll have, especially in cases like this, where like big, cases like homicide, stuff, that you'll have them match. Basically, if the state has 3 experts, the defense has 3, and they match it like that, so one doesn't see more, right?
Yeah. I mean, and it's tough. Because if one had, let's just say if the state had 1 expert, but then defense had 5, obviously the defense would always seem more compelling, or the state. Exactly, vice versa. Yeah. You're going to say, well, I mean, more experts in the field agree with this side than this side, so I'm going to go with that one. And
in a lot of trials, you'll notice that there's generally an even amount.
But the thing that is hard about that is that's on the state to do that, either side, but in this instance, if the expert testimony was so important, which I think it was based on these facts, they have to really guide the jury to, okay, so this is what that means, this is what that piece of the evidence is telling you, and it sounds like they didn't do a great job with that. And
no,
not to knock them, because there's a lot happening in trial.
There is. And obviously, we don't know all the ins and outs of what went on with that and what was admissible completely, right?
Right. We don't have a full transcript of the trial, so we have to speculate a little bit. Also, this trial was kind of far removed in time from this, and that's not something that the jury should consider. That's the
thing, right? You're 100% right, because it was 9 whole years, and that could have very easily cast concern on the investigation for the jurors. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
9 years, it's almost a decade.
It's like, why? So what? You couldn't bring this 3rd-degree murder charge for 9 years because you couldn't put an investigation together? That feels a little suspicious.
It does.
It's not something the jury should have considered, but I wouldn't be shocked if they had.
Or that they didn't feel like, they're not even sure.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
And that leaves us with, what, I guess, if in theory it wasn't Jeremey who did this, what could some other explanations be? The first one, of course, would be, could she have committed suicide? Could she have taken her own life?
And I guess the support for that would be that was what he initially stated on the call. So that is what he's claiming he saw.
He said she jumped. Yeah.
The thing with that is I don't really understand the physical evidence, though. That's interesting, but I
guess this is a possible explanation, but just based on everything we know, it doesn't seem like a likely explanation. And her family, Michelle's family, said ad nauseum, we had no reason to believe she had any issue that would lead her to suicide. Not that that's a be-all, end-all for this theory, but it doesn't seem very likely or supported by the physical evidence.
Which leads us to, could it have been an accident? And again, it's yes, but it also feels very unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, could it have been an accident? Sure. But it's a 4-foot-tall railing.
Unless she was stepping up on it to hang these Christmas lights.
Which, if that's what was happening, and she had just decided...
had several drinks, and she was hanging it up, and she only had one shoe.
She had several drinks, she fought with her husband, and then at 12:30, she got the bug to go hang Christmas lights. Possible? Maybe.
But, my thoughts have been about this, and especially after looking into it, is that Michelle was never on that balcony, right? That Michelle never fell, that she was beaten and then left in the street to die.
And that's what all of the forensic experts that the family retained and that the state ended up putting on their testimony, they all agreed that the injuries she sustained were not from a fall. They were from a blow to the head prior.
So regardless, Jeremey has been tried for his involvement in this case, and he's been acquitted. So whether you believe he's innocent or of this or not, a jury has rendered a verdict, and he cannot be retried for this case because he's protected by the double jeopardy clause.
Yeah, there's, and whatever your feelings on that may be, that is what it is.
Yep, he was acquitted, and we may never get to hear the truth about what happened that night. Maybe Jeremey really has told the truth all along. Maybe he was just really unlucky and that the evidence looked so unfavorable to him.
And maybe. I have a really hard time with it, but again, the jury has rendered its verdict, so that's what we have to accept.
Exactly. And we'd love to hear from you guys about this one. What do you think happened that night? And do you think that justice was served in this case, even if nobody was held responsible? Let us know what you think and check out the photos for this episode on our website, forcrimesake.com, and on social media. We'll post a picture of Little Hamilton and, of course, of Michelle Witherell, who didn't deserve to die that night.
Absolutely not. And let us know what you thought of this episode. If you liked it, let us know. Leave a review. Tell a friend. We always appreciate your feedback.
And, of course, the ham was great today, as usual. I actually have him on my lap under a blanket because that's how we can get him to stay really quiet is we just put a blanket on my lap, and he loves to burrow in there and just hang out.
He lives his whole life for the time he can spend
on my lap under
your lap under a blanket.
He loves it.
That's his happy place.
It is. But yeah, thanks everyone, and we'll be back next week.